London. Early morning. Not the London of postcards, not Big Ben gleaming in afternoon light. This is the other London, the grey one, the one that smells like coal smoke and wet stone and last night's fog that hasn't quite lifted yet. In a comfortable home not far from Baker Street, Dr. John Watson sat across from his wife at the breakfast table. Toast, marmalade, the soft sounds of a domestic morning. Then the maid appeared with a telegram. Watson recognized the handwriting before he even unfolded it. There was only one man in England who wrote with that particular combination of urgency and precision. Have you a couple of days to spare? Have just been wired from the west of England in connection with the Boscombe Valley tragedy. Shall be glad if you will come with me. Air and scenery perfect. Leave Paddington by the 11:15. Sherlock Holmes. Watson's wife looked across the table. Will you go? He was already standing. Paddington Station in 1889 was organized pandemonium. Porters ran with luggage stacked impossibly high. Ladies in traveling clothes stood rigidly against the human current. The smell of coal and hot metal hung in the air like a permanent weather system. And there, at the far end of platform 3, Sherlock Holmes, 6 feet tall, gaunt in the way that suggested his body was simply an inconvenient vehicle for his brain. He wore his long grey traveling cloak and a close-fitting cloth cap, and he was pacing not anxiously, but rhythmically, the way a predator moves in a confined space. He spotted Watson immediately. Good of you to come. It makes a considerable difference having someone I can rely on. Local assistance is either useless or compromised. Hold the corner seats. I'll get the tickets. No greeting, no small talk. That was Holmes. Holmes had brought half a library with him. Newspapers, inquest transcripts, correspondence from Lestrade. He read through all of it with the focused intensity of a surgeon prepping for an operation. Occasionally scribbling notes, occasionally going absolutely still, with his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Past Reading, he gathered every paper into a ball and threw it onto the luggage rack. Have you heard anything of this case? He asked. Not a word. The London press has been thin on details, which is either a failure of journalism or a deliberate obfuscation. I've been working through what I could gather. He steepled his fingers. It is one of those cases that appears on its surface to be so simple that it becomes almost impossible. Watson waited. Singularity, Holmes said, is almost invariably a clue. The more featureless a crime appears, the more dangerous it actually is, because everyone stops looking. Here is what Holmes laid out on that train. Facts gathered from newspapers and the initial police report. Boscombe Valley, a rural district in Herefordshire, England. Rolling farmland, old-growth woodland, and at its center, a small lake called Boscombe Pool, fed by a stream that wound quietly through the valley. The largest landowner in the area, Mr. John Turner, a man who had made his fortune in Australia and returned to England to spend it. Wealthy, private, known to be generous to a fault with certain people. One of those people, Mr. Charles McCarthy, also an Australian, also from the same colonial era. Turner had given McCarthy a farm, Hatherley Farm, essentially rent-free. The two men were seen together frequently, though their relationship defied easy categorization. They weren't quite equals. They weren't quite friends. They were something more complicated than both. McCarthy had a son, James McCarthy, 18 years old. Turner had a daughter, Alice Turner, same age. On the afternoon of Monday, 3rd June, Charles McCarthy left Hatherley Farm at approximately 3 p.m. He told his servant he had an important appointment to keep. He walked toward Boscombe Pool. He never came back. 3 witnesses, 3 different angles on the same disaster. Witness 1, William Crowder, gamekeeper on the Turner estate. He saw Charles McCarthy walking alone toward the pool that afternoon. Minutes later, he saw James McCarthy following same direction, gun under his arm. He believed the father was still in sight when the sun set out behind him. Crowder thought nothing of it until that evening. Witness 2, Patience Moran, 14 years old, daughter of the Boscombe Valley lodgekeeper. She was picking flowers in the woods near the pool when she saw something that made her run. The McCarthys, father and son, were standing at the edge of the trees, and they were not speaking quietly. She described it as violent. The older man's language was harsh, cutting, and James, she saw it clearly, raised his hand as if to strike his father. She ran, told her mother. She had barely finished speaking when James McCarthy came sprinting to their door. No gun, no hat, right hand and sleeve, dark with fresh blood. "My father, something's happened. Please help." When they reached the pool, Charles McCarthy was on the ground. And here is where we need to be precise, because precision matters in a case like this. The body was not seated. It was not propped. It was not arranged in any way that suggested theater or staging. It was on the grass, face up, the way a man falls when something hits him from behind, and gravity does the rest. The posterior third of the left parietal bone, the upper rear of the skull, had been shattered. The left half of the occipital bone, the base of the skull, destroyed. One blow, possibly two, from a heavy, blunt object. Struck from behind. James McCarthy's gun was found on the grass within a few feet of the body. James himself, blood on his hand, no weapon, no coherent explanation, was immediately taken into custody. At the inquest, willful murder. At the magistrate's hearing, referred to the assizes. The case, by every visible metric, was closed. Watson, reading the inquest transcript on the train, said what any reasonable person would say. "I can hardly imagine a more damning case. If circumstantial evidence ever pointed to a criminal, it does so here." Holmes smiled, not warmly, the smile of a man who has seen this mistake made before. "There is nothing more deceptive," he said, "than an obvious fact." He held up one finger. "The Coe signal. That's the first thing. McCarthy called out before he knew his son had returned from Bristol, before he could have known. So that signal, that call across the water, was not for James." Second finger. "The appointment. McCarthy told his servant he had something important to keep at 3 o'clock. His son did not know he was there. His son had not been expected. So who was McCarthy meeting?" Third finger. The dying words. As James held his father in his final moments, the old man mumbled something. James caught only part of it. He described it as sounding like rat. He assumed delirium. Holmes let that sit for a moment. A man dying from a sudden head trauma does not typically become delirious, Watson. He was trying to say something. He was trying to name someone. Fourth finger. The grey cloth. James reported seeing something on the ground, 12 yards from the body, near the tree line. Grey. A coat. Possibly a cloak. When he looked again after his father died, it was gone. Holmes lowered his hand. Someone was there. Someone who fled when James arrived. Someone who had the nerve and the cold-bloodedness to return within 12 yards of a grieving son kneeling over his dead father, retrieve that garment, and vanish back into the trees. The train moved through the English countryside, green fields, stone walls, the sky beginning to cloud. "We are not looking for evidence against James McCarthy," Holmes said. "We are looking for the person James McCarthy does not know exists." Ross, Herefordshire. A pretty market town that had no idea it was sitting at the center of something dark. On the platform, a lean, furtive-looking man in a dust coat and leather leggings, trying and failing to look like he belonged in the countryside. Watson recognized him immediately. Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Lestrade was competent, thorough, and almost entirely wrong about this case, though he didn't know that yet. Holmes, good to have you. I've taken a room at the Hereford Arms, and I've ordered a carriage. I know you'll want to see the scene. It's entirely a question of barometric pressure, Holmes replied. Lestrade stared at him. 29, Holmes continued. No wind, clear sky. I have cigarettes. The sofa will suffice for tonight. He was not going to the crime scene that evening. He had reading to do. At the Hereford Arms, over tea, Lestrade was mid-sentence about the airtight nature of the case against James McCarthy when the door opened. The woman who walked in was not someone you forgot. Violet eyes, flushed cheeks, the kind of composed beauty that collapses completely when something it loves is threatened. She moved through the room like weather, purposeful, unstoppable, and fixed immediately on Holmes with the instinct people have when they need the right person in a crisis. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Not a question, a recognition. I drove here to tell you, James didn't do this. I know it. I've known him since we were children. He is not capable of this. This was Alice Turner, John Turner's daughter, the woman James McCarthy had been pressured to propose to. The woman, though no one in the room knew it yet, at the absolute center of why Charles McCarthy died. Holmes studied her with quiet precision. I think it very probable that he is innocent, he said. Lestrade rolled his eyes. Alice Turner's face transformed, relief flooding in like light under a door. Then Holmes asked, the quarrel, do you know what it was about? She hesitated. Then, James and I, we've always been close, like brother and sister. But Mr. McCarthy, James's father, he wanted us to marry. He pushed for it constantly. James didn't want that. Not because of me, but she stopped. Something she wasn't saying. There were reasons he couldn't, and his father kept pressing. I believe that's what they argued about. And your father? His opinion on the match? He was against it. He never wanted it. Holmes filed that away without expression. One more question. Your father, I understand he's unwell? Her composure flickered. He collapsed when he heard the news. The doctor says his nervous system is shattered. He's been confined to bed. A pause. Mr. McCarthy was the only person alive who knew my father from his time in Victoria, from the mines. Holmes went very still. Victoria, he repeated quietly. The gold mines. Yes. Thank you, Miss Turner. You've been more helpful than you know. Holmes and Lestrade left to visit James McCarthy in prison at Hereford. Watson stayed. He requested the weekly county paper, the one with the full inquest transcript, and spent the evening doing what doctors do. He read the surgical evidence. Posterior third of the left parietal bone, left half of the occipital bone, heavy, blunt weapon. He touched the corresponding location on his own skull. Struck from behind, not from the front, not from the side, from behind, and slightly to the left. When James and his father were witnessed arguing, they were face to face. A man striking another man in a rage does not typically circle behind him first. Watson thought about the grey cloth, 12 yards from the body, gone when James looked again. He thought about a killer, calm enough, cold enough, to return to the scene while a grieving son knelt in the grass, to retrieve one incriminating piece of evidence, to walk back into the trees. He thought about the word rat, a dying man's last breath, his last coherent thought, spent trying to say a name. Rat. What name ends in those sounds? Watson stared at the ceiling until Holmes returned. "What did you learn from James?" "Nothing," Holmes said. "Nothing at all?" "He is not a quick-witted young man, but he has a sound heart, and he is genuinely bewildered, which, in my experience, is either the mark of innocence or the mark of an exceptional actor." A pause. "He is not an exceptional actor." "Then who?" "I would draw your attention to two things," Holmes said, reaching for the cigarette case. "One, Charles McCarthy had a pre-arranged appointment at that pool. His son was not expected. Someone else was. And two, McCarthy called Cooey before he could have known James was back from Bristol. That signal was for someone else. Someone who knew what it meant." He lit the cigarette. "An Australian signal. Between two men who shared a history in Australia." The fire had burned very low. "The glass is still at 29, Holmes said. "No rain tonight. We go to the scene tomorrow morning. Get some sleep, Watson." He picked up his pocket Petrarch and said nothing more. Hatherley Farm. 9 in the morning. Lestrade's carriage had collected them from the Hereford Arms shop. The inspector punctual in the way that men are when they want to appear competent. The farm itself was a wide 2-story stone building, slate roof, grey walls patched with yellow lichen that had been growing there for decades. The kind of place that looks permanent, like it had simply decided to exist and nothing had ever seriously challenged that decision. But the blinds were drawn, the chimneys were cold. A house in which something terrible had happened carries that fact in its silences. The absence of smoke, the absence of sound, a weight in the air that visitors feel before they consciously understand it. Holmes felt none of this. He was already at the door, asking the maid for shoes. Mr. McCarthy's boots, the pair he wore on Monday, and a pair of James McCarthy's boots as well. Not necessarily the ones he had that day, but a representative pair. The maid brought them. What followed was not dramatic. It was methodical. Holmes crouched on the flagstone floor of the entranceway and measured those boots. Not once, not twice, but 7 or 8 times from different reference points. Length, width, heel depth, the angle of wear on the sole, the particular compression pattern that reveals how a man distributes his weight when he walks. Lestrade watched with transparent skepticism. Watson watched with the quiet attention of a man who had seen this process produce miracles before. Then Holmes stood, tucked his measurements into his notebook, and said, "The pool. There are people who study crime scenes, and there are people who read them. The difference is not training. It is not even intelligence exactly. It is something closer to a complete reorganization of perception, the ability to look at a patch of ground and understand that every mark, every depression, every displaced blade of grass is a sentence in a language that most people never learn exists." Sherlock Holmes was fluent in that language, and watching him enter the Boscombe pool crime scene was like watching a man step from one world into another. His face changed first. The jaw set. The brows drew down into hard lines. The eyes, already sharp, took on a quality that Watson would later describe in his notes as steel under pressure. The nostrils flared slightly. The shoulders dropped forward, as if his entire body was orienting itself toward the ground. He didn't walk the path to the pool, he hunted it. Sometimes sprinting forward, sometimes dropping to a sudden halt. Once, making a wide detour into the meadow that made Lestrade mutter something under his breath, circling back with his lens already out, crouched in the wet grass, reading something none of them could see. Boscombe Pool. 50 yards across, reed-lined, the water dark and still in the morning light, reflecting the tree line in a way that made it look deeper than it was. On the Hatherley side, a narrow belt of open grass between the trees and the water's edge, 20 paces across. No more. This was where it happened. This strip of open ground. Lestrade pointed to the exact location where the body had been found. The ground was still soft, soft enough that even now, days later, the traces remained. An impression in the grass where weight had been, a dark, irregular stain that the rain hadn't fully erased. Holmes crouched at the edge of that depression and went very still. Then he began to move, not randomly. He was following something, a sequence, a logic, circling the area in expanding rings, his lens low to the ground, talking under his breath in fragments that Watson strained to hear. 3 separate track sets, same boot, twice walking pace, once running hard, heel barely registering, weight entirely forward. That is when he saw his father on the ground. That bears out the story. He moved slightly left. Father's prints here, pacing back and forth, waiting, impatient. The ground compacted differently under a man who is anxious than under one who is calm. He stopped. Gun-butt impression here. James stood here, listening to his father speak. Weight shifted back. Not aggressive, defensive. Then he froze. Lens inches from the ground. Tiptoes. In every murder, there's a moment when the invisible becomes visible. When the crime stops being a collection of facts and becomes a story with a beginning, a middle, and a name at the end. For Holmes, that moment was a set of footprints in the grass at Boscombe Pool. Footprints that did not belong to James McCarthy. Footprints that did not belong to Charles McCarthy. Footprints that no one else had noticed. Holmes traced the impressions with one finger, not touching, hovering. Square-toed boots, unusual, not working boots, shooting boots, heavy-soled, made for outdoor use but not farm labor. Expensive. He followed them. They come from the tree line, here. They approach the scene. They stop, here, close to where the body was found. Then they retreat. Then they come back. He stood. Twice they came back. The second return. This is critical. The second return happens after James was already at the body. These prints approach to within a dozen yards, then stop, then retreat again, back toward the trees. He looked at Lestrade. Someone retrieved something from near the tree line while James McCarthy was kneeling over his dying father with his back turned. Lestrade said nothing. The grey cloth James reported seeing and then not seeing. This is what was retrieved. A garment, left behind in the haste of flight, returned for at enormous personal risk. Why enormous risk? Watson asked. Because the alternative was worse, Holmes said simply. Whatever that garment was, it identified the killer more certainly than anything else at this scene. He had no choice. Holmes followed the tiptoe prints into the tree line. The woods here were old, oak and ash, and the occasional yew that had been growing since before anyone living could remember. The ground was soft with years of accumulated leaf fall, dark, damp, the kind of ground that keeps secrets oily. Holmes moved through it like he belonged there. At the far edge of the tree belt, standing alone, wider than anything around it, its roots lifting slightly from the earth in great curved arches, was a beech tree, the largest tree in the vicinity. Holmes circled it, stopped at the far side, the side facing away from the pool, got down on his hands and knees, and pressed his face to the ground. Watson watched him work for nearly 10 minutes, turning leaves, examining bark at hand level, then eye level, then as high as he could reach standing on his toes. An envelope came out. Dust and fragments went into it, carefully, precisely. The lens moved across the bark of the tree like a doctor examining a wound. Then, half buried in the moss at the base of the tree, a stone. Not large, not remarkable, The kind of thing you'd walk past 1,000 times without seeing. Holmes picked it up, turned it, weighed it in his palm, slipped it into his coat pocket, stood, brushed his knees, and his entire demeanor shifted. The hunter relaxed. The tension left his shoulders. The case had closed around something in his mind, like a fist. "I think," he said, returning to his normal voice as if surfacing from deep water, "that we can head back now." In the carriage, Lestrade had his notebook open. Holmes, holding the stone, began to speak, not dramatically, not performing, simply reporting, the way a forensic expert delivers findings. Methodical, specific, each point built on physical evidence examined 20 minutes ago. "The killer is a tall man," Lestrade wrote. "His stride length, measured at several points along the tiptoe track, is consistent with a man of approximately 6 feet or above. Stride elongates with height. The math is not complicated. Left-handed." Lestrade looked up. "The wound to Charles McCarthy, posterior left parietal and occipital. A right-handed assailant striking from behind produces an impact bias toward the right side of the skull. The damage here is concentrated on the left. The blow came from someone whose dominant hand is their left. He has a pronounced limp. Right leg. How on earth? The right foot impression throughout the track is deeper than the left. Not from weight distribution or soft ground. That would affect both sides equally. The right heel consistently sinks further. A man who favors his left leg will put compensatory weight through his right heel. This is not subtle once you know what you're looking at." Lestrade was writing quickly now. "He wears thick-soled shooting boots, the square-toed variety, not common, specific to a certain class of outdoorsmen. He wears a gray cloak. We have James McCarthy's testimony for that, and we have the second return to the scene to retrieve it. A man does not risk returning to a murder scene for a garment unless that garment is identifying. He smokes Indian cigars, specifically using a cigar holder." Lestrade stopped writing. "How?" "Ash," Holmes said, "near the base of the beech tree. The quantity and distribution consistent with a man waiting, stationary, for significant period. The ash itself, the color, the texture, the way it had fallen, Indian tobacco, not English, not South American. The residue at the mouthpiece end of the deposit suggests a holder rather than direct contact with the lips. He carries a small blunt penknife from marks on the bark of the beech, at hand height. A man waiting for an unknown length of time, in anxiety or habit, worrying at the bark with a small blade. The cut pattern is consistent with a left-handed grip and a blade that has not been recently sharpened." Holmes held up the stone he had taken from the base of the beech tree. Lestrade took it, turned it over, handed it back. "There are no marks on it." "Correct." "Then how do you know it's the murder weapon?" "4 reasons." Holmes counted on his fingers. 1. The grass beneath it, when I found it, was living and compressed, indicating the stone had been placed there recently. Days, not weeks. 2. There is no natural origin point for this stone in the immediate vicinity. It was brought there, or fell there, from a person. 3. The stone's dimensions and mass are consistent with the wound profile described in the surgical report. A heavy, irregular, blunt surface. McCarthy's skull fracture is not the product of a smooth implement. 4. There is no other candidate weapon anywhere in the scene. The search parties have been over that ground. Nothing else presents. Lestrade studied the stone. "And the murderer?" he said, half challenge, half genuine curiosity now. Holmes looked out the window. The Herefordshire countryside moved past, green and quiet and entirely indifferent. "Is a tall left-handed man, limps on the right, wears shooting boots, carries a grey cloak, smokes Indian cigars through a holder, carries a blunt penknife, and..." He paused. is Australian. There was one piece of evidence that the coroner had dismissed, that James McCarthy had tried to explain and failed, that the jury had noted and set aside. 2 letters, or rather, the last 2 syllables of a word a dying man had tried to say with a shattered skull and failing lungs, while his son held him in the grass by a pool in Herefordshire. Rat. Holmes had been thinking about that word since the train. That evening, back at the hotel, Holmes took a piece of paper and wrote 2 letters on it. He handed it to Watson. "Read that." Watson looked down. "A-R-A-T. Art," Watson said. Holmes placed his hand over the left portion of the paper. "Now." Watson looked Ballarat. The room went very quiet. "Oh," Watson said. "Charles McCarthy was not delirious," Holmes said. "He was not confused. He was dying, and he was doing the one thing he could still do. He was trying to name his killer. He couldn't form the first syllables. His brain was shutting down. His muscles were failing. But he got the end out. The last 2 syllables of a place in Australia. Ballarat. The goldfields," Watson said slowly, "where Turner made his money." "Where Turner made his money," Holmes confirmed, "and where Charles McCarthy, I suspect, was also present, in some capacity." He stood and went to the window. "We now have a profile," he said. "Tall, left-handed, limps on the right, shoots, smokes Indian cigars, wears a grey cloak, Australian, specifically from Ballarat, and familiar with this district," Watson added. "The pool can only be approached through the farm or the estate. A stranger couldn't navigate it without being noticed." "Someone who belongs here," Holmes agreed. "Someone who has been here long enough to know the paths, to know the signals, to know that Cooey meant Charles McCarthy was on his way." He turned from the window. Neither man said the name they were both thinking. They didn't need to. Lestrade had returned for the evening. He sat with his tea and his notes, and the particular stubbornness of a man who has built a case and does not want to watch it come apart. "It's all very elegant, Holmes. Tall man, left-handed, Australian, a stone with no marks, a dying man's last syllable." He set down his cup. "A British jury needs evidence they can see and touch and understand. What you have is a theory." "What I have," Holmes said, "is a convergence of 17 independent observations that point to the same conclusion." "And who does this conclusion point to?" Holmes looked at him steadily. "Someone we will speak to tomorrow." Lestrade waited. Holmes picked up his Petrarch. The conversation was over. By that night, Sherlock Holmes knew 3 things with absolute certainty. He knew the weapon, a stone from the base of a beech tree, unassuming, unmarked, and precisely lethal. He knew the killer's physical profile down to the limp in his right leg and the brand of cigar he smoked. And he knew the name hidden in the last breath of a dying man. Ballarat. There was only one person in Boscombe Valley who had been to Ballarat. Only one person who fit every point of that profile. Only one person who had motive, means, and 25 years of reasons. Tomorrow, Holmes would go to see him, and the man already dying would tell him everything. There is a particular kind of man who spends decades becoming someone else. He leaves behind a country, a name, a version of himself he cannot look at directly. He builds something new, land, money, reputation, a daughter he loves more than his own life. And then, one morning, a knock at the door, and the old version of himself walks back in, and never leaves. Turner Hall announced itself through the tree line before the carriage reached it. A Victorian manor of considerable scale, red brick, high chimneys, tall windows that caught the morning light and gave nothing back. The kind of house that had been built to last centuries and had settled into that permanence with grim satisfaction. The grounds were immaculate, professionally maintained. The gravel drive was swept, the hedgerows clipped, but there was no warmth here. Watson noticed it first, as doctors tend to notice the things that aren't quite right. The absence of movement around a house that employed 6 servants. The way the curtains on the upper floors were drawn even now, mid-morning. The silence that wasn't peaceful, that was held. A house containing a secret always feels like this, like a room where the windows haven't been opened in years. Lestrade stayed with the carriage. Holmes and Watson went in. The bedroom was large and dark and smelled of camphor and the particular staleness that accumulates around a body that has stopped moving freely through the world. The curtains were half drawn. A fire burned low in the grate, unnecessary in June, but the room felt cold regardless. A nurse passed silently through a side door as they entered, and in the bed, John Turner. Watson's clinical eye catalogued him in seconds, the way doctors do involuntarily. The waxen quality of the skin, the visible recession of muscle mass from the face and hands, the particular gauntness that is not from hunger, but from a body consuming itself. The labored quality of every breath, not desperate, but effortful. A man paying full price for each lungful of air. He was not old in years, but he was old in the way that matters. His eyes, though, his eyes were something else. Dark, sunken, and still lit by something that the rest of him was failing to extinguish. He looked at Holmes and Watson for a long moment. Then he spoke, voice low and rough, like gravel shifted by water. "You're Sherlock Holmes." "I am." "I knew you'd come." A pause, a shallow breath. "Knew it the moment I heard your name was on this case. Knew it was finished." He didn't say it with fear. He said it with something closer to relief. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you. There's no point standing for what I have to say." What John Turner told Sherlock Holmes that morning had been locked inside him for the better part of 30 years. No priest had heard it. No doctor. No friend. He had carried it the way some men carry old war wounds, present in every movement, never mentioned, never shown. Until now. Turner began slowly, like a man who has rehearsed the opening and is surprised to find the words still difficult. "I went to Australia young, Victoria, the goldfields at Ballarat." A careful breath. "I was not a good man then. I want to be precise about that. I was not misguided or unlucky or led astray. I made choices, bad ones, consistently. We ran a gang, 7 of us. We robbed the roads, coaches, supply parties, anyone moving through the bush with anything worth taking. We were good at it for a while." Holmes said nothing. His face showed nothing. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without reaction, storing everything. One night, a large party came through, well supplied. We took them. Turner stopped. His jaw tightened. People were hurt. Some were killed. I was there. I did not pull a trigger that night, but I was there, and that is the same thing. One of the 7, Holmes said quietly, was James McCarthy. Turner looked at him directly. "Yes. I got out, made real money, legitimate money, eventually, and left Australia. Came to England, bought this land, built this house." He looked around the room without sentiment. "Became John Turner, Esquire, Justice of the Peace, landowner, respectable man." "And McCarthy?" "McCarthy found me." The words came out flat. "A few years after I settled here, he turned up one day, same grin, same easy manner, as if we'd simply been apart for a season. He wanted the farm. He wanted the farm first, then money, then more money, then access to my accounts, then Turner's hands moved on the bed sheet, not dramatically, just a small tightening of the fingers. It never stopped. That is the thing people do not understand about a man like McCarthy. It never stops, because the moment it stops, his leverage disappears. So he had every reason to keep going, and I had no way to make him stop. How long? A silence that answered before the words did. 25 years. Watson kept his face still. 25 years. He did the arithmetic involuntarily. Turner would have been in his 30s when it started. The farm, the money, the silence. 25 years of pain for one night in the Australian bush, with compound interest, forever. There were times, Turner said, when I thought about going to the police myself, confessing everything, just to end it. A short, humorless sound. That was not quite a laugh, but by then I had Alice, and I couldn't. I simply couldn't. What changed? Holmes asked. 25 years. And then, Monday, June 3rd. Turner's eyes went to the window, the half-drawn curtain, the pale light beyond it. He wanted Alice. The room became very still. Not Alice directly. He was not a sentimental man. He wanted the merger. James and Alice married. My estate folded into his family permanently. He framed it as the arrangement that would set us both free. Turner's voice didn't change pitch, but something behind it did. His son would inherit everything I built, and I would be connected to that man's bloodline for the rest of time and beyond it. He called it freedom, Holmes said. He called it freedom. Turner repeated it with a precision that contained everything. He had been calling things by the wrong names for 25 years. You refused. I'd refused before, many times. He always found a way back. A long pause. But this time, I don't know. I was sick already. I knew I was sick. The doctors hadn't told me yet in plain language, but I knew. And I thought, if I die with this unresolved, Alice will be left alone with him, with James owning everything, with McCarthy's hand in everything I built. So when he sent the signal, "Cooey," Turner said. The word came out quietly, almost gently. Our old signal from the roads in Victoria. He still used it every time he wanted to meet away from the farms, as if we were still those men, as if 30 years hadn't passed. I went to the pool. In 25 years of investigating crime, Sherlock Holmes had heard many confessions. Most of them contained justification, rationalization, the careful construction of a narrative in which the confessor was, if not innocent, then at least understandable. Turner's confession contained none of that. He simply told what happened, in sequence, without decoration. Turner's voice was steady. McCarthy was already there when I arrived, pacing, the way he always paced when he wanted something, back and forth, along the water's edge. He started immediately. Alice and James, the marriage. He had a solicitor's letter drafted, he said, ready to send. He wanted my agreement in writing that day. A breath. There was a stone on the ground near the tree line. I don't know how to explain what happened next in a way that sounds like something a rational man would do. I'm not sure it was rational. I'm not sure I was entirely present in the way I normally am. I picked up the stone. McCarthy had turned away from me. He turned to look out at the pool, the way he did sometimes, when he felt he'd made his point and was waiting for capitulation. And he stopped, not from reluctance, from the plain difficulty of the next words. I struck him once, perhaps twice. I'm not entirely clear. He went down. I ran. You left your cloak, Holmes said. I realized it almost immediately. I'd set it down at the base of the beech tree. I was warm from walking. I remembered it 50 yards into the woods. And you went back. I went back. No hesitation. I came to the edge of the tree line, and James was already there, kneeling beside his father, his back to me. Watson thought involuntarily of the distance Holmes had measured. 12 yards. The second return of the square-toed boots. The cold geometry of what Turner was describing. I watched him for a moment. I don't know why. I should have simply retreated, but I watched. Turner's expression shifted, something crossing it that was not quite identifiable. He was holding the old man's hand, talking to him quietly. And you still went in for the cloak. I had no choice. If it was found, the cloth, the cut of it, the quality, it would have been traced to me within a day. James didn't hear you. He was distressed. His father was dying. He wasn't listening for footsteps. A silence. McCarthy said something, Holmes said, as he was dying. James reported it as rat. Turner looked at him. He was trying to say, Ballarat. Yes, Turner said. I know. Holmes had been still throughout the confession. Now he leaned forward slightly. You are telling me all of this, he said. Why? Turner looked at him with the clarity of a man who has run out of reasons to be indirect. Because James McCarthy is going to hang for something he didn't do. And that troubles you. It troubles me considerably. The understatement of it was almost striking. I did not kill Charles McCarthy so that his son could die in his place. I did not. Whatever else I have done, I did not intend that. And Alice? Holmes said. Your daughter. If you confess, formally, she loses you to a murder charge, possibly the gallows, certainly disgrace. Which is why I am not confessing formally, Turner said. He met Holmes's eyes directly. I am confessing to you. Holmes studied him for a long moment. You understand the distinction you're drawing. I am dying, Mr. Holmes. The doctor uses careful language, but I understand what he is not saying. My heart, my liver. I have months at the outside. And you want? I want James McCarthy acquitted. I want Alice to have whatever time remains with me without the weight of this. And I want... He stopped. For the first time, something in his composure cracked, not dramatically, just a small fault line. I want to die having done one thing right, in the end, just one. Watson watched Holmes. This was the moment he had been watching for, the moment when the case stopped being a puzzle and became something else, something that required more than logic. Holmes was quiet for a long time. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Herefordshire countryside, the fields, the tree line, the pale June sky, the same landscape where, 4 days ago, a man had died at the edge of a quiet pool. Then he turned back. I will not be taking this to Lestrade today, he said. Turner waited. You are, as you say, a dying man. The machinery of justice would take months, months in which you would suffer, Alice would suffer, and James would remain in custody, awaiting an outcome that would arrive too late to matter cleanly. What I am going to ask you to do is write out a full statement, everything you have told me, in detail, signed, witnessed by Dr. Watson. That statement goes into my keeping. If James McCarthy is acquitted at assizes on the existing evidence, the statement remains sealed permanently. It accompanies me to my own grave eventually and goes nowhere. If the case turns against him, if conviction becomes likely, I will present it to the court. The outcome will be what it will be. But James will not hang for a crime he did not commit. Turner was quiet for a moment. And Alice? Alice will have her father for whatever time remains, Holmes said. That is the most I can offer. Watson produced paper from his case. He had brought it, though he could not have said precisely why. Turner wrote slowly. The handwriting was not what it had been. The pen shook slightly. The letters were larger than they would once have been, but it was coherent, detailed, complete. Australia, Ballarat, the gang, the night on the road, McCarthy's arrival in England, 25 years, the final demand, the pool, the stone, the cloak, everything. He signed it. Watson witnessed it. Holmes folded it, placed it inside his breast pocket, and buttoned his coat over it. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." Turner leaned back against his pillows. He looked, Watson thought, fractionally different from when they had entered. Not better, not physically, but lighter somehow. The specific lightness of a man who has set down a weight he has been carrying so long he had forgotten it wasn't part of his body. "Take care of James," Turner said. "He will take care of himself," Holmes replied. "He has more resources than he knows." They left him there, in the half-dark, with the fire and the clock and whatever remained of his time. In the corridor, Watson spoke quietly. "Holmes, what you just did, the statement, the sealed arrangement, that is not strictly—" "No," Holmes agreed. "It is not strictly legal. It is not strictly within my remit. It is arguably an obstruction." "Then why?" Holmes walked a few more steps before answering. "Because Turner will be dead before the legal machinery could process him. Because Alice Turner is an innocent party to all of this. Because James McCarthy is genuinely innocent. And because Charles McCarthy, by every account now available, was a blackmailer who spent 25 years systematically destroying a man who had already tried to leave his past behind. I am not the law, Watson. I am not a judge. I am a man who finds the truth." He glanced over. "What the truth requires, in this particular case, is degree of discretion." Watson said nothing more. They walked downstairs, through the silent house, and out into the June morning. The assizes convened as scheduled. The prosecution presented its case with confidence. It was, on paper, formidable. A witnessed quarrel. A son seen following his father with a weapon. Blood on the defendant's hands. The gun found at the scene. The defense, briefed exhaustively by Holmes the night before, presented the counter-evidence. The wound angle, posterior left parietal and occipital, inconsistent with a right-handed blow from the front. James McCarthy was right-handed. The forensic demonstration was clinical and clear. The footprint analysis, a third set of prints, square-toed, tiptoe approach, double return that did not match James McCarthy's boots, entered into evidence with precise measurements. The timeline of the COE signal, placed before James's return from Bristol, could have been known to his father, indicating a prearranged meeting with a third party. The grey cloth, witnessed by James, subsequently vanished, indicating a second individual at the scene who had reason to retrieve identifying evidence. The prosecution objected at intervals. The judge considered. The evidence was admitted. The sealed statement in Holmes's breast pocket remained there. It was not needed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. James McCarthy stood in the dock the way he had stood throughout, straight-backed, pale, with the particular stillness of a young man who has used up his capacity for anticipating outcomes and simply waits. The foreman rose. On the charge of willful murder, this jury finds the defendant a beat, the whole room on a held breath. Not guilty. The sound that followed was not dramatic. It was something between an exhale and a murmur, the sound of a room full of people releasing something they had been holding. In the gallery, Alice Turner pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders moved once, twice. She did not make a sound. James McCarthy looked up. His eyes moved across the courtroom until they found Holmes, standing at the far edge of the room, near the door, already reaching into his coat for his notebook, as if the verdict was simply one more data point to be logged. Their eyes met. Holmes gave one brief, precise nod. Then he opened the door and walked out into the street. Paddington bound. The same journey, reversed. Lestrade had stayed in Herefordshire. There were administrative details to process, as there always were when a case collapsed. He had shaken Holmes's hand with the particular graciousness of a man who has lost an argument and knows it, and said nothing further. In the carriage, Watson asked the question he had been holding since Turner Hall. The statement, what actually happens to it? It stays where it is, Holmes said, until I determine that it is no longer of consequence, at which point I will destroy it. And if Turner had lived, if he'd recovered, he won't. But if he had, Holmes looked at the window. Indians scrolling past, green and indifferent and beautiful, in the particular way of things that have been beautiful for a very long time. Then I would have had to think more carefully. A pause. I am glad I don't have to. Watson watched him. Does it bother you? He asked. What you did? The arrangement? Holmes was quiet for long enough that Watson thought he might not answer. It bothers me, he said finally, that it doesn't bother me more. He picked up his Petrarch. The subject was closed. John Turner died in the autumn of that year, September. The doctor's estimate had been generous by a month. He died at Turner Hall, in the room where he had given his confession, with Alice beside him. Holmes burned the statement the following week. Watson was present. Neither of them spoke while it burned. James McCarthy, acquitted, free, carrying the bewilderment of a man who nearly died for something he didn't do, spent several months in quiet recovery. The Bristol marriage, it emerged, was legally void. His wife had a prior undisclosed husband. The courts dissolved it automatically. What happened between James McCarthy and Alice Turner after that is not recorded in Watson's case notes. Some things don't need to be. The Boscombe Valley case is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as one of Holmes's cleaner solutions. A misidentified suspect, a hidden killer, a profile built from ash and boot prints, and the last syllable of a dying man's final sentence. But what it actually was is more complicated than that. It was the story of a man who spent 30 years being someone he wasn't, and another man who spent 30 years making sure he couldn't forget who he had been. It was the story of two people, James McCarthy and Alice Turner, who were collateral damage in a war that started before they were born. And it was the story of a detective who found the truth, held it in his hands, looked at it clearly, and then decided that truth and justice are not always the same thing. Sometimes the right answer and the legal answer face in different directions. Sherlock Holmes knew which way to face. That was the Boscombe Valley murder, the complete case. One victim, one wrong suspect, one dying man who told the truth too late, and one detective who decided what to do with it. If this kind of deep dive true crime documentary is what you're here for, subscribe to Detective Equation. Every case gets the full treatment. No shortcuts, no summaries. The complete story, told the way it deserves to be told. The next case is already on the table. Don't miss it.